The train screamed into the station like a dying animal. Clara Whitmore knew the world had shifted under her feet. She stepped down with one battered trunk, one dust-gray dress, with less than $1 tucked in her glove, then looked up at the crooked sign and felt the blood drain from her face. This was Black Hollow, not Red Vale. Not the place where she had promised her father's friend she would deliver the papers. Hidden beneath the false bottom of her trunk. Before she could call to the conductor, the train gave a long metallic groan and pulled away, leaving her in a swirl of smoke, cinders, and silence. The station clerk barely glanced at her when she asked about the connection south. "Next train, tomorrow night, maybe," he muttered, then lost interest, as if stranded women were as common as split rails. Clara tightened her grip on the trunk handle and tried to think. No money for a room, no telegraph open, no familiar face in sight. Only 3 rough men by the freight shed, staring too long and smiling too little. That was when Dread stopped whispering and began speaking plain. She had not simply missed her stop. She had landed where someone expected her to be weak. Then she heard boots, steady and unhurried, and a cowboy emerged from the shadow beside the cattle ramp. Tall, broad-shouldered, coat dusty from the trail. Revolver riding low on his hip like it belonged there more naturally than his own hand. His face was cut hard by sun and weather. A pale scar ran from his jaw into his collar, and his eyes were the cold, clear kind that made liars careful. He looked first at the 3 men, then at Clara, then at the tracks where the train had vanished, and something passed over his face. Not surprise, not pity, only recognition. He crossed the platform, took hold of Clara's trunk, and lifted it like it was no heavier than a saddle blanket. Every lesson she had ever been taught told her to pull back, to demand her property, to distrust strange men in stranger towns. But the 3 men by the shed had already started drifting closer, and the clerk had retreated into his office without offering so much as a warning. The cowboy tipped his chin toward the street and said, "This way." She followed because the night behind him looked dangerous, but the night without him looked worse. Black Hollow opened before them in one long muddy street lined with leaning buildings. A piano stumbled inside the saloon. Laughter broke sharp and mean. Horses stamped at the rail. Lanterns swung in the wind like verdicts waiting to be read. Yet the cowboy moved through town as if he feared none of it. And the town noticed. Men stepped aside for him. Voices dropped when he passed. Power does not always ride in shouting. Sometimes it walks quietly and lets everybody else remember its name. He stopped at a narrow boarding house where an older woman in a wool shawl sat shelling peas on the porch, as if the whole town were no more troublesome than weather. She looked at Clara, then at the trunk, then at the cowboy, and said there was one room left. Clara asked the price and felt shame rise hot in her throat when she saw how little lay in her palm. Before she could speak, the cowboy placed $2 silver on the table inside the door, his hand scarred, his cuff dark with dust. Clara turned to him in disbelief. "I cannot repay that tonight," she said. He leaned one shoulder against the frame and answered without looking at her, "Repay it by staying indoors till morning." There is talk in town. Then he was gone into the street again, leaving only his name behind when the boarding house woman, Miss Harlan, muttered it under her breath. Eli Mercer. Clara took her supper upstairs and watched the town through the lace curtain, while Miss Harlan told her the rest. Eli ran cattle north of Black Hollow, kept mostly to himself, and frightened the sort of men who only laughed when the odds leaned their way. A year earlier, his younger brother had been found shot behind the saloon, and the sheriff had called it a gambling quarrel, but Eli had never believed that, and he had never stopped looking. Clara ought to have slept. But every board creak sounded like a footstep, and every burst of laughter below sounded like a threat. Near midnight, a gunshot cracked across the street. She rushed to the window and saw men spilling out of the saloon. And there, in the middle of the road, stood Eli Mercer, coat open, revolver low, facing the same 3 men she had seen at the station. One clutching a bleeding shoulder, another shouting that Mercer had no proof. The third glancing toward the alley like a trapped animal. Trouble travels faster than trains. And Clara knew, in that instant, the night was no accident at all. Morning dragged the truth into the light. Clara came downstairs with the papers hidden in her trunk spread on the table between her and Eli. freight records, payroll ledgers, names, routes, dates. Enough proof to ruin men who had buried their crimes under dust. She had carried them from Santa Rosa because her late father, once a surveyor for the rail company, had found them before he died and trusted the wrong lawmen too little to leave them behind. Eli read the pages in silence while Miss Harlan poured coffee and pretended not to hear. But when he reached the last sheet, his jaw tightened so hard, the scar near his mouth turned white. His brother's name was there, listed beside a shipment marked corrected after audit. And below that, a note showing he had spoken to a deputy about missing payroll before he was killed. So that was it. Not drink, not gambling, not bad luck. Murder tied to theft, theft tied to gun running, and gun running tied to men in Black Hollow who had known Clara's route before she ever boarded the train. She had been sent here on purpose, intercepted before Red Veil. Eli looked up at her, and for the first time his voice lost its distance. "They were never after your money," he said. "They were after what you carried, and now that they know you are alive, they will come harder." Fear rose in her like floodwater. Yet beneath it, something steadier began to form. Anger, the clean kind, the useful kind. Eli laid out a plan. The noon stage would leave openly for Red Veil, while she slipped through Dry Creek Pass in a feed wagon. But she refused before he finished. She was done being baggage moved from one set of hands to another if the papers mattered. She would ride with them, Miss Harlan snorted, then reached into a biscuit tin under the counter and produced a small pocket pistol. Eli studied Clara for a long moment, then showed her how to brace her wrist, how to breathe, how not to shut her eyes at the report. Outside the windows, the town went about its business with false calm. But Black Hollow had the feel of dry grass before a spark. Some mornings do not bring safety. They only make the danger easier to see. They rode out just after noon, Clara on a restless bay mare, the papers tied flat beneath her coat, Eli beside her on a dark gelding. Every window in town watched them pass. And before they had gone 3 miles, the first rider showed behind them in a rising fan of dust. Then 3 together. Eli did not waste words. "Keep moving," he said, but Dry Creek Pass narrowed ahead into stone and scrub where the trail dipped toward a dry creek bed. Number room to outrun a rifle there, so he turned his horse and drew in one fluid motion. The first shot split the canyon air. Clara flinched, nearly dropped the reins, then remembered his instruction and pulled the mare behind a boulder while dirt burst from the rock beside her face. She fired once and missed so badly it might have been a warning shot to the sky. Fear tried to take her hands, tried to blind her, but rage held them steady. She breathed, aimed again, fired. And the man with the rifle jerked sideways in the saddle and vanished under his own horse. The others scattered for cover. Gun smoke thickened in the heat. Eli dismounted and moved like a man who had rehearsed grief into skill. Firing, shifting, never wasting emotion. One outlaw shouted from behind a rock that Mercer could ride away alive if he left the woman in the papers. Eli answered with a bullet that shattered the man's hat brim and sent him crawling. Clara reloaded with clumsy fingers. Then another rider broke toward her side of the wash. She waited until the last possible breath and pulled the trigger. He went down hard. The rest of the fight collapsed after that, fast and brutal, as violent things often do once one side begins to believe its own death. One man fled north, one bled into the stones. And the last fell when Eli met him in the open with the cold certainty of unfinished mourning. Some men reach the end of fear and become smaller. Others become exactly what the moment requires. Silence came all at once. Clara sat back against the rock with the empty pistol trembling in her hand while Eli crossed to her with blood running down one sleeve. Not enough to kill him, enough to frighten her. She tore a strip from her petticoat and bound the wound while he stood still and let her. Close enough now for her to see that the hardness in him was not cruelty at all, but endurance sharpened by loss. They reached Red Veil by sundown, rode straight past the deputy named in her instructions, and delivered the papers to a judge instead. Warrants were written, telegrams sent, names spoken aloud that had spent too long protected by distance and fear. A week later, Clara returned through Black Hollow to collect the few things she had left behind. and the town seemed smaller than before, as if truth had taken some of its room away. The sheriff had discovered a sudden devotion to duty. The men from the station were either jailed, buried, or running, and Miss Harlan hugged Clara so abruptly it nearly knocked the breath from her. At the platform, Eli set her trunk beside the correct train and stepped back. Evening light caught the scar on his jaw and turned it silver. Clara thanked him for the room, the gun, the ride, and the faith he had finally chosen to spend. He touched the brim of his hat and told her she had paid every debt the moment she chose not to run. The whistle blew, the engine shuddered, and Clara climbed aboard. But before the train pulled free, she looked back and saw him where she had first seen him. Alone on the platform, solid as old law, and she understood at last what had begun the instant he took her trunk and said, "This way." He had not been leading her into danger. He had been leading her through it, and on the far side of it, into the harder life, the stronger life, the one that no missed stop, no crooked town, and no frightened man with a gun would ever again be able to take from her.